It is my pleasure to welcome you to a lecture by Professor Werner Sollors. This lecture is also a keynote presentation in the conference, the international conference, The Ambiguous Semantics of Reeducation and Transnational and Transhistorical Perspective, which has been organized by the America Studies and the Japanese Studies Department at the University of Friedrich-Alexander University in Erlangen and Nuremberg, and also in cooperation with the Amerikahaus in Munich and the Bavarian American Academy. Professor Werner Sollors received his PhD from the Freie Universität in Berlin and is Professor Emeritus of English at Harvard University. Upon having joined the faculty in 1983, he also served as a chair of Afro-American Studies from 1984 to 1990, of History of American Civilization from 1997 to 2002, and of Ethnic Studies from roughly 2001 to 2010. Besides numerous awards for excellency in scholarship and teaching and fellowships, such as from Guggenheim Memorial Foundation and the NEH, Werner Sollors holds an honorary doctorate from the Universität Regensburg and is also a fellow of the Austrian Academy of Sciences and a honorary member of the Bavarian American Academy. Werner Sollors has edited books and published and written extensively on the subjects of ethnicity, pluralism, migration, multiculturalism, including numerous individual authors, among them Olaudah Equiano, Mark Twain, Du Bois, amongst many others. His major publications are Beyond Ethnicity, Consent and Dissent in American Literature and Culture, Neither Black Nor White Yet Both, Thematic Explorations of Interracial Literature, and Ethnic Modernism. His more recent books include Schrift in bildender Kunst von ägyptischen Schreibern zu lesenden Madonnen from 2020, African-American Writing, a Literary Approach, and Challenges of Diversity, Essays on America, 2017. And publications that are directly related to the theme of today's conference are The Temptation of Despair, Tales of the 1940s, a book, and I quote from the publisher's website, about coming to terms with the mid-1940s, the contradictory emotions of a defeated people, sorrow and anger, guilt and pride, despondency and resilience, as well as the ambiguities and paradoxes of Allied victory and occupation. And also a collection of David Grode's interviews with survivors from the concentration camps conducted in 1946, entitled Die Toten habe ich nicht gefragt, published in 2011, which has first appeared in 1949 under the title I Did Not Interview the Dead, from the University of Illinois Press. Today, Professor Sollors will give a lecture about the Fragebogen, the Denazification Questionnaire, as a cultural text. And I'm very much looking forward to your presentation. The floor is yours, Professor Sollors.
Thank you very, very much, Fabian Schäfer, for this very, very kind introduction. Thanks also to Heike Paul and to Marga Schweiger-Wilhelm for inviting me to give this lecture. It goes back to a multi-year research project that came out of King's College. It was a European Union project at the time that Britain was still part of the European Union, and Lara Feigl directed it. And in the course of that series of events it was a series on occupations, I became interested in the format of the questionnaire. So the title is Everybody Gets Fragebogen Sooner or Later, the Denazification Questionnaire as Cultural Text. I want to set my timer so I don't go over time. In the immediate post-war years, I should also say we won't have a PowerPoint today. If you're experiencing withdrawal syndrome of images, just go Google Fragebogen, or also look Fragebogen-Lied. You might as well get onto that as well, and you find diversions. So in the immediate post-war years, the Allied forces employed different methods for denazifying Germany. France, for example, started with a German self-clearing process that was called auto-épuration, and then reviewed public figures of interest, limiting the process to 230,000 people in the French zone. Now that may seem a large number, but it was still a qualitative approach. The German and French files of the French zone have now been digitized as a joint project of the state of Baden-Württemberg and the French Foreign Ministry archives in La Courneuve. It's 1.5 million digitized pages that include the reviews of such figures as Leni Riefenstahl, Martin Heidegger, and Otto Dix, and thereby constitute an open invitation to new scholarship on that whole batch of denazification material. This work could follow the pioneering approach of Michael Dack, D-A-C-K, Dack, who has examined a sample of 200 completed questionnaires from all 4 zones from the point of view of narrative psychology. Completed by more than 20 million Germans in all 4 zones, in other words, 1/3 of the adult German population, it was, as Dack points out, the largest hitherto extant survey. The results could also now be reviewed from different approaches. For example, just to sort out what were the differences among the 4 allies and going about the process. By contrast to France, the United States, and that's my exclusive focus today, took a quantitative approach and disseminated the Fragebogen. It became an English word, Fragebogen, or questionnaire, to 13 million persons in the American zone, as military governor Lucius B. Clay mentions with pride in his 1950 memoir, Decision in Germany, adding that, quote, perhaps never before in world history has such a mass undertaking to purge society been undertaken. Others called this bureaucratic process revolution by decree, artificial revolution from above on a prostrate society in a state of temporary disintegration. It was also the result of a perfectionist plan that ran into predictable and unpredictable problems and obstacles along the way. Its wide and unwieldy scope and uneven implementation made the questionnaire a largely failed experiment. Its unreliability turned it into an invitation to create and circulate myths. For the Allies, it was the belief that a questionnaire could actually eliminate Nazism. For those who filled in the Fragebogen with exonerating autobiographical assessments and testimonials by others that were known popularly as Persilscheine after the detergent, it was the myth of their own anti-Nazi past, resistance, or anti-Nazi mindset at least. And finally, for writers, the questionnaire was a text that could inspire creative work, including fiction. So my talk presents the questions the Fragebogen asked against the background of American denazification efforts, examines 2 examples of completed questionnaires by writers, reviews several texts that were inspired by the Fragebogen, and concludes with a brief comment on its possible origins. So the first, denazification. The word denazification itself was a new coinage of the mid-1940s. The Maryland political scientist Elmer Plischke claimed to have invented it in analogy to demilitarization. Planning for the occupation was conducted in the German Country Unit, or GCU, within the US War Department and the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces, or SHAEF. This was also the age of acronyms. Everybody loved acronyms, so SHAEF, GCU. So in 1944, the GCU began to think about what it started calling the denazification problem. As Plischke explained in a 1947 article, he had proposed the word denazification, not only because of his analogy to demilitarization, but because it served as a perfect overall single term to contain the 9 different major policies intended to terminate Nazi rule forever. I give you the order in which he lists them. 1, liquidating the Nazi party together with its affiliated and subsidiary organizations. 2, eradicating Nazism from German legislation. 3, changing names of parks, streets, and public ways. 4, seizing property of the Nazi party and of individual Nazis. 5, prohibiting Nazi privileges, benefits, and pensions. 6, arresting and detaining Nazi leaders, influential Nazi supporters, and other persons dangerous to the Allied occupation or its objectives. 7, removing and excluding from public office and from positions of responsibility and importance in quasi-public and private enterprise, members of the Nazi party who had been more than nominal participants in its activities, active supporters of Nazism, and other persons hostile to Allied purposes. Number 8 is preventing Nazi propaganda, and 9, prohibiting the public playing or singing of Nazi anthems and the public display of Nazi flags and other party insignia and paraphernalia. Now, much of this pretty randomly listed denazification agenda had clear goals. It was easy to determine what it meant to arrest leaders, and Nazi insignia and street signs could quickly be removed and property confiscated. But removing and excluding from public office and from positions of responsibility, whatever that is, in quasi-public and private enterprise, more than nominal members of the Nazi party. What is a more than nominal member of the Nazi party? That was a daunting and complex task, since by 1945, about 8.5 million Germans had become members of the party, whether by conviction, opportunism, or force of circumstance. On what basis could such a determination be made? Were you only a nominal member, or were you a supporter of Nazism? That's the question. And so the questionnaire was believed to provide the basis. Now we come to the questions. There were several different versions of the Fragebogen in the US zone. If you Google the word Fragebogen, you get at least 2 of those questionnaires in Google Images. At first in English-German bilingual format, and later on in German only. The first Fragebogen issued by the American military government had a nice name, MGPSG9, and it contained many unnumbered questions that were organized in groups. It was 4 pages long. The revised and expanded later version, which was MGPSG9A, I'm going to call it 9A from now on for short, 6 pages long, was the one that became the symbol of all questionnaires. While many questions were identical to those on the earlier form, the new version from May 1945 numbered all the questions from 1 to 131. So you had 131 questions in numerical order. A German version from 1948 expanded the catalog to 145 questions. The 2-page Meldebogen, issued on the basis of the Law for Liberation from National Socialism and Militarism that was passed on March 5th, 1946, and transferred the task of denazification to German hearings in so-called Spruchkammern, or juries, contained only 14 numbered questions with a few sub-questions. All these questionnaires have an opening set of questions about personal data and identity, profession, residence, military service, employment history, religion, and so forth, followed by a central section asking about membership in the NSDAP and all affiliated Nazi organizations. Just to give you an example, the most famous questionnaire, the 9A, had questions 41 to 95, or 55 out of 135 out of 131 questions devoted to this issue of membership in all these various Nazi organizations. As one would expect, the long questionnaires went into far more detail. So for example, 9A began with a prompt, list positions for which you're under consideration. It also asked for the party membership number and added to the question about religious affiliation, this I find very interesting, a request to state whether the subject had ever left a denomination. So at the time when there was a bit of a battle between the Nazi party and the churches, if at that moment you left, that would be an indication of something, I suppose. I don't know whether they were fine in reading it. It inquired about weight and height, marital status, titles of nobility, education starting with primary school, income and assets, membership in political parties the Nazis had forbidden, but also benefits incurred from National Socialist rule, even if you were not a member, publications one had made, speeches one had given, travel abroad, and especially work in territories occupied by Germany during the war, and knowledge of foreign languages. So quite a bit of detail. 9A also asked Germans to reveal for which party they had voted in November 1932 and in March 1933, as well as in much debated question 101 to indicate any incriminating political facts, not only about themselves, but also about their relatives. Do you have any relatives who have committed particular acts in the name of Nazism? Completion of the Fragebogen was mandatory in order to be cleared for employment, and giving false answers was criminalized. Germans who were caught cheating could be punished very publicly. Thousands were caught, as Duck reports, who looked at these figures. Their punishment would then prompt others to answer their questionnaire honestly. The movie actor Harry Peel, for example, who had falsely claimed on the Fragebogen from the British authorities never to have joined the SS, was sentenced in November 1945 to 6 months imprisonment and 5,000 mark fine, a case that was widely publicized and therefore served exactly as this kind of example that would encourage others to answer the questionnaire honestly. Now, it's open to question whether such harsh sentences really did lead to more honesty, or whether Hannah Arendt was right in her assessment that, quote, Europeans do not always believe in telling the absolute truth when an official body asks embarrassing questions. I think cannot beat Hannah Arendt on good formulations. Though briefer, the German Meldebogen added an interesting request for self-classification at the end. You could put yourself into one of 5 categories. First was Hauptschuldiger, or major offender. Second was Belasteter, or offender. The third was Minder Belasteter, or lesser offender. The fourth was Mitläufer, or follower. And the fifth was Entlasteter. So by far the largest group that emerged from this process was classified by the process rather than the self-classification as Mitläufer. Another very large group that did not appear under those 5 categories was amnesty, because amnesties were regularly given out just to relieve the bureaucracy. Weihnachtsamnestie was a big one. So the piles were reduced that way. Riefenstahl, by the way, was exonerated, so she got into category 5. Some answers. As a set of texts that enjoyed mass distribution and that needed not only to be read carefully by millions, but also to be responded to, the Fragebogen would seem to be just about an ideal text to be examined through the lens of reader response theory. For its text literally needed to be completed by its readers, which is the major premise of reader response approaches. The responses were made under oath. even if that could mean self-incrimination. And responses were not limited to filling in the questionnaires themselves, as the process of doing so also stimulated other responses in new texts and cultural productions, including some rather lengthy autobiographical sketches exonerating and explaining why somebody became a member of the party or left or whatever it was that needed an explanation. And the Persilscheine, testimonials given by others that were appended to the questionnaire. So each questionnaire then became a sort of package of answering the straight questions and then more material. I think it is thus justified to consider the Flagelborgen a cultural text that served as an Erinnerungsort, a site of memory for post-war Germany. And Duck said one of the accomplishments of the Flagelborgen was that so many Germans have a memory of their grandfather or whatever the ancestor is, having not really been a Nazi, because that was this autobiographical narrative that the questionnaire almost compelled you to come up with. John Dos Passos was perceptive when he gave his reportage on post-war Germany the title Land of the Flagelborgen. And the following two examples may give you a sense of the genre. So you see some of the answers now to the questions. The first is Erich Kästner, the ironist, best known as author of the children's books Emil und die Detektive and Pünktchen and Anton. He was in the Austrian town of Meierhofen when the war ended, and there he was required to fill in the original questionnaire 9 in Tyrol, and then the expanded 9A in München when he was applying to become feuilleton editor of the American edited German language paper Die Neue Zeitung that was printed on the same printing press that had previously been used by Völkischer Beobachter. Kästner seems to have answered all questions, including 101 about his relatives. His answer was none of them held any Nazi positions. He weighed only at 115 pounds, was not a member of any Nazi organization, and had voted for the Social Democrats in 1932 and 1933. Kästner responded fully to question 115, whether he had ever been arrested, had resisted the Nazis, or was constrained by them in his freedom of movement or profession. He had indeed been arrested twice by the Gestapo, and he could not publish any books in Germany between 1933 and 1945. He reported his international trips, commented that the records relating to his income had been burned as the result of bombing, but that he had paid taxes in Charlottenburg Ost, which surely must have records of his income. And he admitted that even though he had been blacklisted by the Nazis, he had received the exceptional permission, by the way, it was permission from Goebbels himself, to write the scripts for the film Münchhausen in 1943 and also Der kleine Grenzverkehr, again in 1943. But Kästner could not work under his own name. He had to turn into Berthold Bürger, as he states in his answer to question 3, andere von ihnen benutzte Namen. So he used the name Berthold Bürger. Both films were ultimately released even without his pseudonym Berthold Bürger. It just is completely absent in the credits. Apart perhaps from an allusion to the Allied bombing that destroyed some of his income records, one finds little indication of Kästner's characteristic irony. This changes when one looks at Kästner's diaries of the time. This I find would be an interesting approach to take with more well-known subjects, I think especially writers and intellectuals, comparing what they wrote in the diaries at the time and in letters and how they answered the questionnaire or how they described the situation of the questionnaire. So in his diaries, he writes, speaking with an American officer by the name of Typograph. He said, a little while ago, I was in Renatastraße with an American Gestapo gentleman. Gestapo Herr is the word he uses. in uniform who is Greek American and goes by the name of typograph. He took my personal details for a card file and handed me a 6-page questionnaire to fill out. For although he believes me, of course he cannot know if I had worked under any pseudonyms for the Nazis. Unfortunately, such distrust seems justified since the American authorities appear to be getting much false information. By the way, the completed questionnaires are sent to Paris. It is a mystery to me who would be able there to check the accuracy of the information. So this is his comment on the questionnaire in his diary. Calling an American officer Gestapo Herr probably reveals some of Kästner's true feelings about the questionnaire and may have seemed heretical enough for him to omit when he revised his diary for publication in 1961. Since Kästner wondered how the Fragebogen answers could be checked, it deserves mention that the questionnaires could indeed be spot checked against sets of Nazi, SS, and SA membership files that had fallen into Allied hands and became ultimately the core holdings of the Berlin Document Center. Although more systematic checks became possible only in 1976, in 46, when the Allied effort was already flagging a little bit. After 1 year of reading thousands of questionnaires, the enthusiasm was waning, and the idea was let the Germans handle it themselves. Another writer's questionnaire I read is that of the far more implicated Ina Seidel, who had signed the writer's loyalty oath to the Führer in 1933, and she had sent so many congratulations to Hitler over the years that, alluding to her best-selling novel Das Wunschkind, Werner Bergengruen had called her Das Glückwunschkind. In December 1945, she filled in the questionnaire and even answered question 101, mentioning that her own son-in-law, Ernst Schulte-Strathaus, had been Reichsamtsleiter on Rudolf Hess's staff, but had been expelled from the party in 1941 and imprisoned by the Gestapo for 2 years. This, by the way, was the result of Hess's flight to England. So his entire staff was arrested afterwards, and he was high ranking in that staff and therefore sent to a prison. And Wikipedia tells us that Schulte-Strathaus had been involved in party purchases of art that had been confiscated from Jewish dealers, and also in the creation of the infamous Nazi Institut zur Erforschung der Judenfrage. This all before 1941. Seidel reported that she was a member of the Reichsschrifttumskammer from 1933 to 1945. She stated that she had voted for the conservative nationalist Deutsche Volkspartei in 1932 and 1933 and weighed 112 pounds. She answered question 115 about the issue whether she had suffered under Nazism. She said, 2 of my books could not be reprinted after an initial success. This can be testified by my publishing house. And so in the question about income and assets, she repeats that and documents the decline of her royalties after 1942, when 2 of her most popular books could no longer be reprinted. Now, the Fragebogen and literature. In literary works published in the 1940s and 50s, the Fragebogen functions as a narrative symbol and a plot device. American texts often incorporate the German word Fragebogen, sometimes also Spruchkammer, when representing the annoying bureaucratic work the completed questionnaires demanded from Allied armies and German juries. An entry in the comical Leaves from the Diary of a Military Governor in Bavaria in 1947 opens with a reference to the questionnaire. No matter how long I live, I'll never get the word Fragebogen out of my head. Everybody in Germany, everything in Germany revolves around it. He does not like the word Spruchkammer, which he hears in his sleep and still can't pronounce just right. He defines it as a purging court. So again, we have this purge theme, épuration, auto-épuration, purge, what Clay mentioned the term, and he calls it purging court. American literary representations typically question the wisdom of the whole questionnaire procedure. A representative scene appears in David Davidson's The Steeper Cliff from 1947, a novel informed by Davidson's time as a press officer in München. The US Army wants to install a new mayor of the fictional Bavarian town of Galensburg, and one candidate is the publisher Steber. Cooper, through whom we are reading this novel that is narrated in the third person, knows that Steber is a good choice since he was suspended for a couple of months by Goebbels himself in 1934 and had his business closed down altogether in 1941. But Captain Jones, quote, pushed a packet of printed forms across his desk. Fragebogen, he said, have Steber fill out 10 copies. Cooper glanced once more at the long, three-paneled form, the merciless catechism of 131 questions, and the narrator reviews many of them before making his comment in the novel's characteristic hard-boiled style of narration. This was the age of many documents and no privacy, the age when a bomb sheared away the walls while you sat in the bathroom. Yet there was much that never got on any Fragebogen. There were no blank spaces for fears, no dotted lines for the detailing of agonies and inner misfortunes. There was no conqueror yet who could compel the answers to the important questions precisely and conscientiously. Similarly, in Alan Marcus's 1948 novel, Straw to Make Brick, based on the author's experience in the occupation army, a Lieutenant Casey laments that the only school superintendent the army has been able to approve must be 80 if he's a day, and that teachers are hard to find. We've had hundreds of Fragebogen submitted last week, but you know, most of these guys are not usable. And those that are, well, I don't know. I expect half of them are lying on the Fragebogen. Hence, Casey wonders whether we're screwing up with the Fragebogen. In a long scene in Zelda Popkin's novel, Small Victory, the professorial protagonist, Randolph Barlow, he was a specialist on Prussian militarism who comes to help in the occupation in Germany. He is working at a desk in occupied Frankfurt with a pile of Fragebogen and ends up being frightened at his own self-righteousness. He's thinking, am I becoming like them, is his big worry. After an academic who had been married to a Jewish woman tries to explain the constraints that made him join the Nazi party, although it turned out that he was unable thereby to save his own daughter. Barlow is physically affected by the meeting that leaves him in a trap of confusion. He was ready to judge somebody, and the more he heard about the case, the more he was frightened of his own will to rush to judgment. From the point of view of often harrowing actual life experiences, the dry questionnaire seemed ridiculously inadequate. It is represented as an instrument that would only make self-righteous bureaucrats happy, like a thin-faced sergeant whom John Dos Passos encountered in Bad Wiessee on November 6, 1945, and later caricatured. The sergeant proudly proclaims a 92% denazification rate. And when asked how it's done, he replies, it's the Fragebogen. You don't know about the Fragebogen? The Fragebogen is the greatest thing in Germany. If they get past this, they can hold any job they want. If they don't, they can't have any position where they employ labor or exercise a skilled trade or profession. They can't do nothing but pick and shovel work. And if they lie on their Fragebogen, we have them up in court and they don't get off easy. Every man or woman who has any position of authority has got to make out a Fragebogen. It turns out if they're big Nazis, it's mandatory arrest. If they're small Nazis, they report to a labor gang. Everybody gets Fragebogen sooner or later. Then we know what's what. I love this sketch as a clear satire on behalf of from John Dos Passos' point of view. So Dos Passos' Land of the Fragebogen did not only make the word worthy of a title of a report, but also transformed it into a verb in the passive tense. Like everybody gets Flagelborgen sooner or later. The bureaucrat's triumphant exclamation might well summarize American literary responses of the period. Dos Passos also describes the Flagelborgen as a long questionnaire of the type developed by the United States immigration inspectors. And Davidson, as we saw, called it a merciless catechism of 131 questions. Other writers followed suit with metaphors. The Swedish novelist Stig Dagerman, for example, who wrote an excellent report about post-war Germany called German Autumn, 1947, he refers to it as a kind of ideological equivalent of tax returns. I like that too. Dagerman also writes that the Spruchkammer performance can seem like an example of applied existentialism, and mentions that the Spruchkammer was commonly referred to by people as Bruchkammer or Sprichkammer. So he also had a good flair for picking up jokes as a way of dealing with situations of incongruity. Among German writers, Wolfgang Borchert, as Alvin Wagentin has shown, commented critically on the Flagelborgen when he pointed out that as long as he had to fill in 16-page questionnaires in order to get published in a magazine, talking about democracy and individual freedom was meaningless. And you see also that the pages of the questionnaire sometimes get exaggerated, or the 3 columns, and it just seems it should have been longer, is the aesthetic reaction often to it. Sabine Kalf quoted Theodor Heus's complaint about the eternal questionnaire and reported Margaret Bovary's critique that it was impossible to determine the exact degree of affinity with National Socialism via questionnaires, since they could not estimate the reasons for certain behavior. The entertainer Just Scheu, just the German word for shy, and just like the English word just, who was known for such early post-war shows as Doppelt oder Nichts and the Funklotterie, wrote and sang a humorous Flagelborgenlied about a victim of Nazi persecution paranoia who has nightmares about his party membership when he sees the numbers 1 to 131. I try to render it a little bit. Ich bin Fragebogenkrank, kennen Sie das fürchterliche Leiden? In meinem Fragebogen stimmt zwar ziemlich alles, Gott sei Dank, und das will heutzutage was bedeuten, aber trotzdem werde ich einen Tick nicht los. Was mache ich bloß? Was mache ich bloß? Ich sehe nur Zahlen 1 bis 131. Habe ich auch alles richtig ausgefüllt? Was weiß ich? Ich träume jede Nacht, ich wäre in etwas drin gewesen. Dann schrecke ich zitternd und mit Schweiß bedeckt empor. Ich träume jede Nacht, ich wäre doch in was reingetreten. Dass gerade ich kein Nazi sein soll, kommt mir komisch vor. And he finally goes to the doctor who says he can't help him. He has the persecution paranoia of the National Socialist Party. In the second stanza, the nightmares return after the singer has completed the 12th page of the questionnaire. Again, it's a longer thing. And now he imagines that his wife tells him to leave her bed and her democratic house after she has seen his questionnaire. Google the song if you like to have a real performance. By far the most extensive and most popular German response to the questionnaire in the period was Ernst von Salomon's odd and vivid memoir called Der Fragebogen, which was published in an edition of 10,000 on the 20th of March, 1951, when Allied censorship ended, with a British license and on French paper. Despite worried reviews that it received, it sold another 200,000 copies by the end of 1952. It was one of the real Revolt bestsellers of the period. Salomon thoroughly disliked what he perceived as American self-righteousness. The Americans wanted to know the truth, not in order to learn it, but in order to sit in judgment. according to the laws of a morality they regarded as universal, and in whose name they had set out to punish the German crimes and thereby to bring a strangely misguided people back on the right path through re-education. Die deutschen Verbrechen zu bestrafen und das merkwürdig irregeleitete Volk durch eine re-education wieder auf den richtigen Weg zu bringen. He puts in a few English words like re-education and atrocity, I think, later on, so working with that. Salomon thinks of the questionnaire as an examination of conscience, Gewissenserforschung, a police wanted notice, a Steckbrief, or a certificate of ancestry, an Ahnenpass, such as the one that had been required by the Nazis. His central aesthetic ruse is that he uses the 131 questions of the Flagelborgen 9a to structure his 800-page memoir, taking ample opportunities to question and talk back to the questionnaires so as to accuse the questioners and drive home the absurdity of the Flagelborg. He complains about being coerced to fill in the Flagelborg, about its stupidity, and he even mocks the typographical errors that the version of 9a he was apparently working with contained. Salomon incorporates all 131 questions, sometimes giving brief and at times very, very long responses. Perhaps the most memorable short answer is the one he gives to question 101, the question asking for implicated relatives. Antwort wird verweigert. Answer refused. And he explains, only with difficulty can I refrain from the pleasure of answering these two questions. I would have many strange things to say, but I don't. I think these two questions are insidious, perfide, so he says. I understand that this omission is a violation of military government regulations and exposes me to prosecution and punishment. I hope that the military government, for its part, cannot refrain from the pleasure of indicting and punishing the only person in the world who really takes their questionnaire seriously. So this is his response to not telling the answer about implicated relatives. Salomon, a Weimar period extreme right-wing Freikorps fighter and conspirator who was directly involved in the assassination of Walter Rathenau. So that's really far extreme, violent right in the Weimar years. However, never joined the Nazi party. So you have another problem again with the questionnaire situation. His life partner at the end of the war was the Jewish woman Ille Gotthelf. He stylizes himself as a mixture of bohemian bon vivant, political adventurer, and Prussian nationalist, and as a victim of the Americans. He uses the word Opfer when in the American internment camp on the Natternberg near Deggendorf, where he was imprisoned from 1945 to 1946, along with 4,000 other internees. The last 150 pages of his book constitute the longest single response to the questionnaire, triggered by just one, the last unnumbered rubric on 9a, remarks, Bemerkungen. So you could write anything you want under Bemerkungen, and he writes 150 printed pages of an autobiography. But he focuses on the American camp regime where he was interned and describes it in the starkest manner, describes brutal, unprovoked beatings and the very strong suggestion that Ille was gang raped by her during her interrogation by at least 6 American soldiers. What happened to Ille in there? Was geschah mit Ille da drin? He asks twice, and then repeats it, and then describes when she comes out. I stared at her, and she quickly gave me a sideways smile. She had no belt. The dress was buttoned askew. Her stockings were hanging down. Kästner had called his interrogating officer Gestapo Herr, but Salomon fleshes out what that term might mean when articulated by an anti-American polemicist on the German far right. In Salomon's version, worse than that is a trigger warning for you. The Americans are also portrayed as the true anti-Semites. he relates the account of a fellow inmate, the actor Wolf Aqua, who claimed that none of the American officers spoke with the New York lawyer Krebs during his camp visit. When Krebs left, Robertson said, "I cannot stand Hitler, but he has done something good. He has killed the Jews." Aqua shouts back, hey, because the Germans killed the Jews, that's why we're here. "Wrong," said Robertson. "You are here because you didn't kill all the Jews." Although Goran Ries prefaced the English translation with trigger warnings about Salomon's display of Schadenfreude and his nerve to dissociate himself from all the responsibility of the crimes of National Socialism, the translator Constantine Fitzgibbon omitted this passage. She couldn't make herself translate it. Was it perhaps too much to put this revolting comment into the mouth of an Allied officer, a comment that criticizes Germans for not having completed the genocide, and at the same time implies that Jews, illustrated by the presence of New York lawyer Krebs, were the ones responsible for the Germans' post-war imprisonment? Alfred Polgar put it like this in his review: "The unspoken motto, 'just like us with the Nazis,' hovers over Salomon's description of what was happening in American camps. When he is shown atrocity photographs, and as I already mentioned, he uses the word atrocity, Salomon calmly questions whether the number of victims makes any difference. Still, neither he nor Ille can sleep the night after first seeing those photographs. Yet Salomon is extremely sympathetic toward those who are classified as war criminals, a term he uses in English and puts in quotation marks. For example, there is at the very end of the book a rather positive portrait of Hans Ludin, who became German emissary to Slovakia in 1941, and as such, signed deportation orders sending many Jews to Auschwitz. Ludin refuses Salomon's offer to help him escape and goes to a certain death, having told Salomon that he always followed his conscience, which was not always easy. Salomon's novel ends with Ludin's gruesome execution in Czechoslovakia as a war criminal, a strangulation that lasted 20 minutes. Ludin's and the book's last words are, "Es lebe Deutschland." So you get a good sense of his political beliefs. In lieu of a Persilschein, the book's coda offers the ironic certification of ER, the friend and publisher of Salomon, Ernst Rowohlt. Since Ernst von Salomon structured his memoir following the questionnaire, it might be interesting to compare his novel with the questionnaire he actually filled in. So I undertook the attempt to locate a copy of Salomon's 131 question Flagelborgen, but it failed. No copy of it seems to be existent among his papers in Marbach. In the Staatsarchiv München, I finally found the shortest of questionnaires that he had to answer when he was interned, only 1 page long. So Ernst von Salomon never actually had to fill in the long Denazification Questionnaire that his autobiographical novel pretended to complete. The format of the book that became a bestseller because it spoke to so many Germans who did have to fill in the Flagelborgen was the publisher's idea. Quote, "Rowohlt told me that if I wanted to publish anything, I had to fill out the long questionnaire. He gave me such a thing, and I set about answering the questions one by one." It may be the ultimate irony that Salomon's Der Fragebogen is now routinely cited by historians as the most easily accessible source for the 131 questions of the Denazification Questionnaire, when the book was actually a blatant attempt to mock the Americans and to demolish their Fragebogen while pretending to answer it, thus propounding the misconception that the author had actually filled in the military government's 5A questionnaire. It's also, if you look for the questionnaire in that book, the questions are of course spread out through the entire novel, so actually rather hard to isolate and to find. Okay, this is my timer and I'm perfect here with the conclusion. As Sabine Kalf has shown, Margaret Bovary in her Amerika-Fibel für erwachsene Deutsche explain questionnaires as a normal part of American life, rather than as a tool specifically devised to wear out the Germans' patience. Bovary reproduces a Hollerith punch card and connects the data collection, multiple choice tests, IQ questionnaires, and public opinion polls to the format of the Fragebogen. Now, this sounds like a plausible explanation, but the questionnaire actually had somewhat more complex origins and was not directly an outgrowth of a specifically American faith in quantitative assessment. Historians, starting with William Griffith's dissertation submitted in 1950, but never published in book form, have delineated the intellectual and bureaucratic background against which the idea of a thorough weeding out, not just of the political, bureaucratic, and economic elites, but of the vast masses of party members and sympathizers emerged. Apparently, it was a real surprise to me, it was Frankfurt School thinking represented in 1944-45 in the Office of Strategic Services by Franz Neumann and Herbert Marcuse that laid some of the intellectual foundations for the official plans of the occupation. The idea was that Nazism had created a widespread form of false consciousness in order to create a more progressive post-war Germany. All representatives implicated in the Nazi order had to be removed, and Neumann and Marcuse prepared blacklists for removal, white lists for replacements, as well as in between gray lists. And this division of the population into categories proved compatible with proposals in the planning units for a detailed questionnaire. So Parry Biddiscombe pointed out the irony that, quote, Germans themselves, albeit exiles, introduced the idea and methods of denazification that would later become the embodiment of American occupation policy. More than that, they were German Marxists. Marcuse would become a 1960s hero. Marxists who believed that denazification would be a step toward revolutionary change in Germany. Skeptics in the army and SHAEF G5 unit, of course, did not share that belief, but they had no alternative plan for eliminating the Nazis. And so the Fragebogen became the massively applied instrument that created many bureaucratic headaches for the Allies and became a sinister embodiment of America to many of those who had to complete it. The Americanness of the Fragebogen may thus just be another myth surrounding a text that has given rise to more than its fair share of post-war myths. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sollors, for this beautiful presentation and also reminding us of the beauty of a non-PowerPoint lecture, even including a even more beautiful musical performance. I've listened to the original and you were on point. I think there's no need to search for it on YouTube. We have a little bit of time for questions and comments, and I hope, because we have this dual system running, that they get through to me and I can pose them to you. As far as I can tell now, there is not yet anything. I wanted to maybe then start to pose a question myself, because I found it very, very interesting that you kind of draw this line between the Fragebogen and then also the quiz show with the example of Just Scheu, and then also ending with Bovary's criticism of American positivism or empiricist social science. And I think that if the Fragebogen itself might not be what Bovary was thinking of or kind of coming with her criticism from, but if you include because to use this verb, the Fragebogening, if that works, didn't end with the denazification campaign. You have the Omgus studies, you have the Heikok surveys. So the Germans were constantly questioned, right? And I've done a little bit of research myself. In the 1950s, I found this commentary by a journalist in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, who cynically stated that the interest of the Allies in the questionnaire game, das Fragebogenspiel, had obviously subsided. And the Germans therefore had to console themselves with the manifold quizzes which were regularly posed to them on the radio and in magazines. So this posture of being questioned continued through the surveys that also come more from a social science background. And then also, if you include this kind of re-education as Americanization through the reprogramming of media and popular culture, you have like this posture of questioning and being questioned as by the occupier, and then as by the occupying, this kind of in asymmetrical power structure that kind of continued, I think.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. I've thought about the quiz shows as an offshoot, but one gets used to divide one's life in response to a set of questions that one gets. And the way Duck looked at this was that the questions gave people a chance to rethink of themselves as lining up all the points where they had hesitated or were thinking of something they didn't agree with, that they may not have articulated, but they now had a chance to do. And so in hindsight, they could structure their lives as being more anti-Nazi, and even making up things also, of having whole groups of people with whom they shared this feeling. That, I think, was one of the ways the question structured a new form of telling one's life. And I think the format in itself is also different. When you wanted to become a member of the Nazi Party, you went to the party and signed a little form. Although it could be dicey. I once came across a Berlin journalist after you had to be, I forgot when, 35, you had to be a member of the Schrifttumskammer in order to be a journalist. This was a journalist who clearly didn't want to. And in his papers, there were 3 letters. The first one was, I've been an ardent follower of your movement from the 20s, but my busy life I never got around to applying. So hereby I want to be a member of the Schrifttumskammer. The second one said, the law of the 1st of April requires journalists to be a member. Therefore, I cannot help but apply to membership. Neither of those he sent off. The one he sent off was, I'm applying for membership. I think that was obviously the compromise that he worked out in his conscience. A very interesting thing too, because how can we determine on the basis of a single questionnaire or a document? So in a sense, they were not used to the 131 question format. It may very well have been that this form of questionnaire then had an afterlife in, as I said, in quiz shows, in all kinds of ways in which question and answer games were played, and also answers that could sort of avoid a little bit the thrust of the question, additional materials, remarks, something like that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the additional comments. I've got a question, and I will read it out to you. Can you say a bit more about the logistics of the Flagelborgen distribution? Where were they printed? How were they disseminated, collected, and evaluated institutionally and otherwise? And well, it's an anonymous question. I don't know where this comes from.
I came across one printing press in Frankfurt that printed quite a few, together also with, you had to have maps of the zones of Germany, and they were disseminated very widely. They're probably not quite as much in the millions, but they're certainly in the hundreds of thousands of the maps of the 4 zones of occupation. And the printer in the first month didn't yet have an emblem of a Soviet flag. So they used a Nazi flag and simply put a hammer and sickle where the swastika had been. So that first edition is very funny. But that was of Atlas Verlag or something in Frankfurt. And they published questionnaires as well. I think some of them may already have been printed before the Allies arrived. Some were printed in England, some were printed in France. So I think the masses add up. But if you think of 20 million total, you have to remember that 13 million of those 20 were American forms. So you had 4 occupying power, and 1 power had far more than half of the print. So I think any printing press would help, is what I would think, with such an enormously large volume. And the paper quality is very bad when you work with the originals of those. It's always this, yellow paper that disintegrates in your fingers now. That's why digitalization is really necessary with those forms. I would imagine there were many, many printing presses in Germany as well as in the countries of origin of the occupying powers.
Do you, because we were touching about on this topic in the conference, in the terms of unofficial manuals, for at this instance, at this presentation, it was for Japanese students being sent to the US in the time of the occupation. So were there like of unofficial manuals, or like did you come across any kind of advice of how to correctly, or how to do the Flagelborgen in the right way so that you don't get prosecuted and that you get a position? Was there anything kind of like this black or gray literature of manual like publications, or even rumors of how to get around it? Or
I think the manuals were given out to the people who had administered the questionnaire, handing out the questionnaires, and maybe they said a few words on top, but those manuals were pretty tough. I mean, since in '45, there was still a very vituperative attitude toward Germany. So it was, you'll see a lot of ruins, but you don't have to live in them, sort of the tone. And, don't trust these guys. They've done terrible things and they will lie and cheat. And, so try to catch them if they lie and cheat. That sort of was more the instruction for the people who surveyed it. But the people who were involved in giving them out very often were, of course, all kinds of different people, many of whom seem to have found it quite unbearable, both in terms of physical volume, every day sitting in the IG Farben building and doing nothing but reading through these questionnaires, and then sometimes summoning people to get clarification of some points, so complaints about the volume. They had some guidance, but I haven't come across any pamphlet given to Germans about how to answer it. I mean, the questionnaire in itself included directions on how to answer it. At the beginning, there was an oath that you were declaring under oath, and that you were aware that any falsehood would be punishable by law. So I think you got the gist of it. So it was self-explanatory, even on the even the long form was still relatively short. I mean, 131 questions sounds like a lot, but since 50 questions concern any subunit of the party, so you could very quickly, if you were not, it was all no, one line. If you were whatever BDM, but not party, something that was a little more, you have to think about this question and that question. But the general gist was try to be honest. I think where the inventiveness came in, and that there may have been the question of the manuals, that subjects were encouraged to submit additional things, like the Bemerkung at the end, and to have letters from friends, or particular from people who had been in the resistance, or people who had emigrated and remembered that they were really good guys and good neighbors and never had been, anti-Jewish, for example. So that was a very good plus, a letter like that in your files. So I think there must have been a guideline too for the people who handed out the thing to encourage shaky cases to come up with additional testimonies, because how can you make sense of the initial? There are a whole bunch of movies too that show the scene of, somebody sitting, what's it called, Berlin Story, but as the whole first part is in the Frankfurt ruins, and has one of those offices with all the piles of the questionnaires sitting there. And Billy Wilder has a scene in Foreign Affair where a young boy who draws a swastika on his father's overcoat is, getting grilled there by an American officer. So that's I don't think there were pamphlets for the citizens. No.
I'm having another, maybe a last question, because I think we almost over time. The text novels that you discuss are hardly canonical, and many of them are not known anymore today, even as they are bestsellers in their time. Is there a German-American archive of the time that is worth to rediscover we talked about the role of literature in the context of re-education. Do these texts change prevalent views on re-education? And this is a question by Markus Faltermeier of the Amerikahaus.
Well, I mean, the genre novels, I think. I quoted some reports, like Dagerman is my favorite book. I think that certainly deserves and has been retranslated into German just maybe 5 or 10 years ago, relatively recently. There was a quick translation when it first came out, The German Autumn. That I think is a very, very good book about occupation, and includes, I think, the only book I've seen that has a chapter on jokes people were telling. So an anthropologist's interest too in, and very dispassionate. He was an anarchist novelist and sort of looked at the whole world through literary and slightly depressed eyes too. So he had a very good wire to the general mood that surrounded him in post-war Germany. That I think is probably the best single book I've read of the period 45 to 50. You know, the Marcus, Davidson, and Popkin, they're sort of in the genre of, you know, film noir, tough talk, and the ruin setting enhances all of that, and everything a bit misanthropic, but not too terribly, you know, misanthropic. So at the end, something still seems to be possible somehow against all these odds. So not great works of art, but have very interesting scenes that are in all 3 cases based on real observation. Popkin, I also looked at her diaries for the same time, and she simply used verbatim some of the things that she heard in the novel. So they're sort of really richly enmeshed in the matter of the time. But I haven't come. I mean, for me, the film A Foreign Affair by Billy Wilder, I think, is probably the work also of the 40s that one can look at to get a sense, much better than Rossellini's Germania Anno Zero, which you know, has this kind of return of Nietzscheism in the form of a teacher-student relationship. It seemed like a little odd in the film, though it has good scenes. But I think Billy Wilder gets also the question of casting judgment on Marlene Dietrich, which, you know, it's already such an interesting choice because she was so well known for her anti-Nazi activity. So she is the Nazi woman who gets judged in the film, and the film kind of, you know, resists that in some fashion as well. So those are, I think, more that film, and the report by Dagerman, I think, is the best book that I know.
Thank you. I think we have come to an end with this wonderful conversation, and I once again would like to thank you for the lecture, and again for the musical performance. I'm still impressed, and we'll be going back to the conference, but you will have time to spend the rest of the day with the weather looked nice when you showed me.
Very nice.
Yeah. Thank you again, Werner Sollors. Goodbye.
Bye bye.
We. Yeah.